Thank you so much, Michael. I'm really excited to be here and to revisit this essay, which I wrote a few years ago. And it was very much influenced by the documentary about the 1831 college that Michael was involved in. So really helpful to have this conversation and to connect today. So I'm going to start by just briefly talking a little bit about what inspired me to write this essay and how it came about. And then I'm going to run through some of the main sections of the essay and specifically focusing on the connections with the what could have been the first HBCU in New Haven. So this project began actually as a paper for a class I took a few years back with Dr. Ben Justice. I think Ben might be at the webinar today. So shout out to Ben. It's a great class, really amazing class that inspired me in many different ways. So as it happened in the syllabus, we talked about the Yale report in 1 week, and then the next week, lots of content to cover. The next week was a discussion about the 1831 meeting that decided the fate of the African American college. And so the two things were positioned already kind of close in my mind. And just realizing that they occurred just a few years apart, I was curious to do some research on whether or not the New Haven faculty that was responsible for the Yale report was also present at the meeting and involved with these decisions, knowing that, of course, the college proposal would have been of a lot of great interest to Yale as an institution. So I started exploring the racial climate in New Haven at this time, which all made me read the Yale report very differently. It's not a document with an explicit racial agenda, but I felt it was important to contextualize it in its time. So in this essay that I wrote, I argue essentially that the things are connected, both directly in terms of Yale faculty and affiliates that were involved in the rejection of the college, but also I think in ways that are perhaps more subtle and require examination about the relationship between higher education, power, and white national progress. So it's important to talk about colonizationism as kind of a overarching philosophy or ideology that I think connects the two things I'm talking about. So it connects the Yale report to the fate of the African American college. I talk a little bit about it on the slide for those not familiar with this idea, which was, colonizationism was anti-slavery, but it had some uncomfortable connections, remaining with the South, and in general, the concept of repatriation of emancipated slaves. And it's notable that Yale faculty that wrote the report, including Jeremiah Day, Benjamin Silliman, and other Yale affiliates, were very notable, very well-known colonizationists at this time. So I thought I'd also run through the Yale report itself, because it's a document that is not widely known outside of education circles, or even, basically history of education circles. However, I think that reading it today, anybody that is, works at a college or goes to one or is affiliated with one will definitely recognize some of the language as being kind of endemic to university mission statements ever since. So the Yale report was actually two reports. It was two sections. Part one talked about, it outlined Yale's educational plan. And then part two defended the classical curriculum. It was written, as I said, the lead writers were Reverend Jeremiah Day, who was the president at the time, and faculty members including Benjamin Silliman and James Kingsley. It was endorsed by the full faculty and corporation at this time, at Yale, and it was published in Silliman's influential American Journal of Science and Arts in 1829, allowing it to reach a wide national audience and influencing many colleges in turn. So in essence, the report argues that classical education cultivates critical thinking, mental discipline, and moral character. These are qualities that were deemed essential for shaping a well-rounded individual, as well as critical for the growth of the nation. So the report, first and foremost, makes this really strong case that higher education is necessary. A certain kind of higher education is necessary for the growth of the instability of the nation. The report stresses that only a foundation in classical languages and liberal arts could instill the mental discipline and academic rigor necessary for lifelong learning. And according to this view, it really actually doesn't matter what subject the student ends up studying. So they could be, a lawyer, a senator, a businessman, it doesn't matter. As long as they have this foundation, this common core connection to Western thought, that's the primary thing. It would allow them to rule, essentially to rule the nation, right? Because we're talking about elite education for the ruling class. It also took a kind of a hard stance against mechanical or industrial training, which was viewed as below the rate of a Yale caliber education. And that point is important in my essay. Towards the end, I talk about Samuel Armstrong's methods of industrial education, which can be viewed as the inverse or the opposite of what the Yale report is espousing. So to summarize, the argument of the Yale report is that liberal education imparts a common core that connects students to Western civilization. And while race is never mentioned, when we say students, we definitely mean white men of privilege. The fact that they will be the rulers of the nation is taken for granted here. It should be noted that contextually, the Yale report was a response to calls for curricular reform. So that's kind of what it came out of. And these calls were very common at this time. They were, not just aimed at Yale, but other institutions, because the public was wondering if classical education is still valid, if it's still appropriate for a growing and industrializing country. Yale's response through this report is that yes, it is important, and in fact, it's necessary, as I've alluded to the health and the prosperity of the nation. So as opposed to just viewing it as a kind of back and forth between college administrators, scholars have recognized that it has it's a political statement. It has a political function. And while it's not original in a sense, because there have been other statements before it saying more or less the same things, it reinforced those statements with the weight of Yale, which at the time was, the largest, most important, obviously very prestigious university to reinforce these statements. The report frames liberal education as a pathway to wealth and power for an enterprising white elite. The pursuit and preservation of wealth, and I will qualify that to say white wealth, is deeply embedded in the report's vision, and it shapes its definition of the purpose of education in a society. So the answer to the continual stability and prosperity of the nation, according to the report, is Yale itself and the specific brand of education only it could provide. Next, I'm going to turn to the proposal for the African American Men's College in New Haven, because it offers such a vivid example of the racial context in which the Yale report was written. And again, shout out to the documentary by Tobias Cropper and Michael Morand that details the proposal itself in the town meeting. So instead of going through that, I will focus on specifically the Yale connections I saw. I also want to highlight a book by Hilary Moss called Schooling Citizens. It flashed on my slides earlier on. It's an essential read for understanding the racial and economic context of New Haven at this time. To briefly summarize what is a lot more in that book, as the co-capital of Connecticut and the state's largest city, New Haven was considered by many to be progressive and a place of that centered literacy and learning, which is why this African-American college proposal came about and was situated there. James Pennington, who is a notable abolitionist minister, actually heard about the college proposal, and moved to New Haven with the hopes of attending this African-American men's college. However, as Hilary Moss and others write, the combination of rapid industrialization and ongoing emancipation in the North was volatile and unsympathetic to Black education in the city at this time. In addition, Connecticut's deep political ties to Southern slave owners meant that the wealth accumulated by New Haven elites was also dependent on enslaved labor still at this time, which in 1830s was the nation's second capital investment next to land. Definitions of American identity that excluded African Americans fed the public discourse at this time, and I should note there that that was because of colonizationism. So colonizationism really provided the ammunition that destroyed the prospects for this African-American college. And Hilary Moss does this really well, which is to tie the availability of higher education to African Americans with the ability to have rights to citizenship, right? And so those two things were intertwined and made the college proposal seem threatening to New Haven's white elite. In addition, there was something specific about that proposal, which is that it combined industrial and classical education. So it saw the importance of both. And that in particular, and I would argue the classical part, was very much offensive to the New Haven elite. So this next slide just kind of looks at a rough sketch of the overlap, if you will, between what happened in 1831 when the African-American college was rejected, and Yale faculty incorporation and colonizationist activity, and of course individuals involved in writing the Yale Report. So in essence, New Haven's white elite, including Yale faculty, organized their profits alongside white interests, which meant that the African-American college stood very little chance of succeeding. Reading through the statements of the colonizationist society at this time shows that they actually succeeded in perpetuating a connection between African-American education, instability, rebellion, general societal chaos, etc. That fed into the perception that New Haven was under siege, which permeated the conversation in 1831, culminating with local papers linking Nat Turner's rebellion to the proposed African-American college. So the parallels here are that, the Yale Report is all about how white higher education leads to stability and prosperity. And at the same time, as contrast, Black higher education does the opposite. So simultaneously, as elite white American colleges like Yale were engaging in high-level conversations about the role of the Republican curriculum, their faculty and leadership participated in efforts to stifle African-American access to education and, in extension, civic rights. Black education signaled a threat to the preservation and growth of white entrepreneurial wealth. Colonizationists crafted this narrative that depicted African Americans as inarticulate, unintelligent and incapable of education by design in order to remove them from the public sphere. The authors of the Yale Report shared in this urge. Their path forward for Republican higher education rejected, ignored, and erased African Americans. It rested on a thoroughly imagined white racial cohesiveness, which they hoped would be accomplished through white wealth and enterprise. So all 4 of the men who spoke up against the college and 6 of the 9 who did not speak, but signaled, signed the opposition statement, were deeply involved with Yale. I have the gist of what the meeting, in 1831 concluded here on the slide, where you could see a lot of this rhetorical connections being made between Yale as a good thing and the African-American college as a bad thing, right? The next part of my paper takes a look at, more specifically, 2 of these individuals, these key figures, Benjamin Silliman and David Daggett, as, kind of a case study of the type of white intellectual that at this, was anti-slavery at the same time, had these, white supremacist agenda, essentially. So the 2 intellectuals here represented here are different. Benjamin Silliman and David Daggett, but they all kind of end up in the same place. So Silliman, for instance, was a sometimes passionate opponent of slavery and very self-aware at times of his financial reliance on the institution that he opposed, but he was also an avid colonizationist. And there is a financial incentive, financial tie to all of this, because as he said about modernizing Yale's curriculum, he could rely on the patronage of Southern slaveholding alumni. One notable example is John C. Calhoun, who was able to enable the publication of the American Journal of Science and Arts. David Daggett, professor of law, was also part of the faculty at the time of writing the Yale Report, and he's a very notable figure in the history of resistance to African American education. He presided over the Prudhoe Crandall case, and where he judged that African Americans were not citizens and had no legal standing. A couple of slides ago, there was an image of a pamphlet that he wrote in the 1790s, explicitly linking African American education to economic instability, violence, and just chaos in general. So the last bit of my paper talks about the legacy of the Yale Report, and I look at industrial education as practiced by Samuel Armstrong and others in Hampton and Tuskegee, because again, that was part of what we learned in the class, and it just struck me as such a direct opposite of what the Yale Report was talking about. So in contrast to the rigorous academic training, testing, and recitations that were required of students at Yale, Hampton students worked long hours in the field or were taught how to sew and cook if they were female, preparing them for a subordinate role. If Yale enabled self-determination and training the ruling class, Armstrong ultimately wanted to shape a subservient class of low-wage laborers that did not have the ability to fully participate in governing. So it is possible to view the two, Yale Report and Armstrong's model, as 2 pieces of a puzzle that fit together, ensuring proper relationship between capitalists and workers in a racialized political economy. I will say that there's more nuance to this, and I think that the binary, in part enforced by the Yale Report between classical and industrial education, definitely requires examination. But overall, looking at the stark contrasts between the 2 approaches, I think is also productive. So I end kind of with this idea of what is the question that the Yale Report addressed. It addressed what the elite needs and what the white ruling class needs. And the question that it did not address is what type of education can alleviate the problems of oppression, both local and global, community instability, identity ambiguity, and class conflict. And I won't read the conclusion of my paper, but it kind of connects that to present day in terms of, I'm just wondering if higher education institutions have been able to define or to answer that question still to this day, and where, we can productively look at the influence of the Yale Report for good and for bad in where we are with that.